Well, welcome to Barrel Banter, the channel where we talk all things whiskey. My name is Chris, and today we're going to be talking about Garrison Brothers Distillery out of High, Texas. Bourbon drinkers are pretty particular when it comes to this wonderful liquid that we get to call whiskey. And a lot of people even think that bourbon can't really be bourbon unless it comes from Kentucky. But that's actually not true. There are distilleries all over the United States now that make bourbon. And one of the ones that's been doing it the longest is Garrison Brothers out of High. Now, if you've been around bourbon any length of time, you've probably heard people talk about something called the Texas funk. And the reason this phrase gets thrown around a lot is, if you didn't know this, Texas is a little bit hotter than Kentucky. Now, I myself live in Houston, so we get the heat and the humidity. It's a horrible, lethal combination. It's nothing like a state where you actually get 4 seasons like Kentucky. So the aging environment out here in Texas can be pretty harsh. In fact, out in the barrel houses at Garrison Brothers, you're getting temperatures well above 100 in the heat of the summer. And so you're talking about some insanely extreme aging environments for these whiskeys. And because of that, Garrison Brothers has a really, really unique flavor profile. And what this often gets referred to is kind of like a funky oak flavor, because you get an extreme oak flavor a lot of times from these bourbons. And the reason for that being is that whiskey is coming in and out of that oak a lot more extreme than it does in Kentucky. And so you take on a lot of those flavors pretty early. In fact, if you look at this bottle of Garrison Brothers here, this is just their regular old small batch in a boot flask. This was only aged 3 years, and this is darker than a lot of my high age bourbon. And when you get something like Cowboy here, that's roughly somewhere between 6 to 7 years, depending on the year, sometimes even as far as 8 years, you start to get a dark chocolate color almost. I mean, it's kind of crazy when you look at it in the glass that's full as opposed to normal whiskey. But the question is any of it really good? Well, if you can't tell by the amount of bottles that I have, I would say, yeah, Garrison Brothers is pretty good. But I think there's a caveat to Garrison Brothers that people have to understand. This is not Kentucky bourbon. And so because it's not Kentucky bourbon, people just naturally assume that it should be Kentucky bourbon, meaning that it should have all the same flavors as Kentucky bourbon. I think one of the best ways I've heard the difference between Garrison Brothers and Kentucky bourbon talked about actually comes from one of its co-founders, Charlie Garrison. In one of their documentaries they did for a Cowboy bourbon release, he talked about this concept of thinking of themselves kind of like being part of Scotland, in how all the different scotches in Scotland, depending on the region, have a lot of different flavors and complexities to them. And he said he thinks the same thing can become true of bourbon in America, that you may have kind of your highland versus your lowland bourbons and the differences that come from that. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think, to be honest, one of the things that bourbon's really bad at is celebrating differences. We really like when something has these very specific flavor profiles that if it doesn't hit like 2 or 3 of these notes, we're all of a sudden going, okay, it can't possibly be bourbon. But I think the differences between bourbons like Garrison Brothers and things like Crittenden's in Mississippi and Detling in Alabama really should be celebrated rather than kind of balked at. And I think that's one of the things that I see most with stuff like this, is people are turned off by a brand like Garrison because right off the bat people go, it's got that Texas funk, I don't want to try it. Well, you may find that your palate actually does like the harder oak flavors and the things that come through in this, because I'll tell you, as somebody that's pretty new to Garrison Brothers just this past year, I found out I actually really did like Garrison Brothers. And the way that I found out was my buddy and I decided that we were going to go do the tour up at Garrison Brothers because we had some free time and it was only about a 2-hour drive. And we decided, we're going to go do the good tour, the high reserve tasting, so we can try everything that they have and not just their small batch. And for me, I was really blown away by the things that I got out of their high-end bottles. Things like the Balmoral and the Cowboy bourbon that we got to try that day ended up being phenomenal bottles. In fact, I came home with a Balmoral that day specifically because of how good I thought it was. And it led me to think about how we often immediately judge a book by its cover, and we assume that just because something has a high price tag or comes from somewhere different than we're used to, it's got to be bad, right? Well, I don't think that's true. In fact, I want to talk about what I love about Garrison Brothers, and I'm going to use two bourbons as an example. I'm going to talk about their regular small batch, which is probably the easiest thing to find. And I'm also going to talk about Cowboy bourbon. Now, this is the 2023 Cowboy that is 140.9 proof. So this is a whopper of a whiskey, but it is absolutely phenomenal. And the most recent one I picked up is the Guadalupe Cask Strength here. And it's probably one of the most unique whiskeys I've ever had. I think this tastes like somebody took coffee and raisins and chocolate and cinnamon and just like blended it up into a whiskey, and it's absolutely phenomenal. But I think these two bourbons are probably the pinnacle of Garrison Brothers. You're talking about its flagship product and what they consider to be their best product. And so I want to talk about those. So Garrison Brothers has a wheated mash bill, and it's typically rumored to be based something similar to the Weller mash bill. And there's a lot of history behind that. As Dan Garrison was getting started, he actually got to meet with plenty of the whiskey legends, and Elmer T. Lee in particular was one that actually helped him kind of get started and kind of give him his blessing. And so he has a wheated mash bill through all of his products, Dan Garrison does, and it shows. It's got a sweeter profile. I kind of note it's like a dark, kind of like a dark brown sugar that comes through. So right off the bat, what I get are some notes of like oak, a little bit of leather, not really any spice on this. You get that kind of dark brown sugar molasses flavor that I was talking about. And the oak has this little bit of funk to it that people kind of naturally balk at. But for me, I actually find it to be really nice. Yeah, that's great. It's got spice. It's got this wonderful kind of cinnamon, and the flavors that I get on the palate are chocolate and raisin and that spice, that vanilla, and that molasses comes through, and then that oak just kind of washes over everything. And for me, I like how different this is. Like if I go put this next to Buffalo Trace or to Weller or to things like my Bardstown wheated, you know, you're going to get a lot of differences. If I compare this to any of my other wheated products, it's a noticeably different bottle. It's not quite as light and fruity as a lot of wheaters are, but I like the intensity that this brings. And so for this to be what is 94 proof, I think you get a ton of flavor for something that's sub 100 proof. And one of the things that I really like about the regular Garrison Brothers is I can tell it's a high quality whiskey. Now, it does have a little bit of youthfulness to it, but because it's a wheater, sometimes that comes across as like a grassy hay note. And I actually like it. I think it plays well with a lot of the flavors they have. I would love to see this bottle get to a 4-year age statement. But I understand, given where they're at and the size, that may not be possible. But that being said, I'd say great bottle. Now, the biggest factor with this is price. And I totally understand that. So one of the biggest factors, obviously, with this is price. This is a decently expensive whiskey for what it is, because it's not a high age. And so to pay $80 for the 750 milliliter, I think it's 70 to 80 depending on where you're at. I understand that they're asking a lot for an entry-level buy-in to a product. And I think that's a very fair statement to make about Garrison Brothers. But from my experience, Garrison Brothers is creating a really good product. It is still considered a craft whiskey, and so this is not going to be able to price. They're not going to be able to price themselves like Buffalo Trace and some of these bigger brands. They just don't have the amount. They don't have the workforce. They don't have the supply to be able to do that. And some of it comes from them wanting to charge a premium. They think they have a good product. I believe they have a good product, and they want to charge like they have a good product. But one of the things that I do love about them is there's a lot of care that goes into the process for them. I mean, everything comes from Texas. All of their grains do. They distill everything in-house. They age everything in-house. They bottle it in-house. In fact, one of the things that I think is so cool about them is they're such a small company. They only employ, I think it was 7 full-time employees, if I remember correctly. And all of their bottling is done by volunteers. In fact, just a couple of months ago, I got to go be a part of that process and really get a firsthand look at just how much care goes into the whiskey process at Garrison Brothers, and it's absolutely fantastic. I'll tell you, if you ever get the chance to do the bottling with them, Leah does a great job. Her and Matt were the two people that kind of headed it up for us, and it was a phenomenal experience, and you really get to see the love and care that goes into every one of these bottles. They treat you like family when you're there. You can tell they're a family, and that family makes some stupidly good whiskey, in my opinion. So $80, you got to decide whether that's worth it for you. But for me, I like having the different whiskeys. When I tried getting into Scotch, I found that I didn't really care for the Speyside and things like that because it was just kind of too close to whiskey. I know that sherry isn't a flavor that's in there, but it's just sweet. And I found that I actually enjoy peated Scotch. I don't like it nearly as much as I like bourbon, but I like the difference in the flavor profile. And so for me, I like that with Garrison Brothers, I get different flavors. Now, some people swear this tastes like licking sawdust. Some people think it tastes like licking a leather boot. That's not really flavors that I get in their entirety. I understand maybe where some of that would come from. But for me, it's got a really interesting flavor that I really enjoy, and I'd buy it again every day. Now, I think if you're talking Garrison Brothers, there is a noticeable, and I do mean noticeable, quality step up when you go to their higher end bottles. Garrison Brothers higher end bottles start, I believe, at $150 for the regular Guadalupe. This is the cask strength. And then you have bottles like Balmoral that were $180, and I believe Cowboy's about $230 if I remember correctly. I got that bottle in a trade. But these bottles, to me, are kind of some of the epitome of what Texas whiskey can be. I think they do a really good job of highlighting the strengths of Garrison Brothers whiskey, and they do a really good job with that. And to me, Cowboy Bourbon is one of those ones that I think does a really good job with that. I can't speak to years prior. I know that I've had the 2024, the 2023, and I own the 2023. And man, for this to be 140 proof, it has so much flavor. It's just incredible. You get some of that same, that raisin, that chocolate, that caramel, and man, the chocolate flavor takes over so much in this. And the mouth feels incredible. And honestly, to be 140 proof, this thing doesn't punch you in the face like you would think it would. Like, I've had some high proof whiskey that will just knock your socks off, but I think this has great flavor. And again, what I love about it, it's intense like I imagine Texas whiskey should be. I don't really want Texas whiskey to be wimpy. If I want something that's gonna kind of represent Texas, I want something that's bold, in your face bourbon. And to me, that's what I get out of Garrison Brothers. And I get the same thing with Cowboy. Yeah, just good Texas flavors. And the extra age on that, like I said, that's somewhere between 6 to 8 years, depending on the year, really does a lot for that bottle to showcase those Texas flavors. Now, I'll tell you, my favorite bottle that I have right now is probably this Balmoral. In fact, the only reason I didn't pour it right now is because I want to savor this. This is probably one of my favorite bottles I own, period, right now. And this starts off as their honeydew, which is their small batch mixed with, infused with Texas wildfire honey, and that's a cask strength that they then age in cognac barrels and proof it down to 114 proof. And the flavor on that is unbelievable. It tastes a lot like honeysuckle. There's a lot of extra fruit flavors, and that cognac influence is really great. And again, everything just plays well. These flavors in their whiskey is so bold to start out that it plays so well with a lot of their finishing stuff. And so I'm a huge fan of this brand and what they do. And again, I think the biggest issue with Garrison Brothers comes down to price. If you're not willing to pay $80 to jump in or $150 to get into their higher end products, I understand it. I think this is the biggest contention point for me. $80 for a product like this, it's hard to charge. But $150, $180, $230, to me, these whiskeys stand up so much to a lot of the higher end products from other companies that are charging the same, if not more. And so I think Garrison Brothers is doing a great job of creating their own space within the bourbon world. So if you ever find yourself in High Texas, go visit the distillery, go check out Garrison Brothers, give them a try and see what they're all about. But I think Texas bourbon is doing a great job, and I think it's only gonna get better. But my opinion is not the only one that matters. Let me know what you think about Texas bourbon. Do you enjoy it? Have you tried Garrison Brothers? Do you think it's better? Do you think it's worse? Do you think it's just different in a good way? Do you think it's different in a bad way? We all have opinions and we can talk about them together, and I'd love to do that with you. But thank you so much again for watching. We'll see you next time, and as always, drink responsibly.